recording. Now, what I want to talk about today is the use of zones and corners to make adjustments in a profile. So I will share my screen. Interesting. And I can find the window I want to share. Oh, it's not. Oh, there it is. I can't see it for looking. Okay. I've just got a profile here, which has come in as a example of a profile. This is one of Wayne's. And so we're looking at, we have, in the previous session, we've discussed the whole concept of the early part of the roast and whether or not we want that to follow the line. What we're going to talk about today is some of the techniques we can get to get things on the line further up. So let's look at this roast, and this is a very typical pattern for a roast in a KAFFELOGIC. You'll see that around about 140, 150, 160 degrees, the roast comes onto the line very nicely and follows the profile line very closely. And you can see here, like it really gets really close there from about 150 up to about 164. It's super nice on the line. And then there sort of seem to be some jitters coming up here. And then around about 180 degrees, you'll see the red line gets away from the blue altogether. It gets up above the line. Now, what's going on here and how we correct it? I like to use the image of, imagine that you are steering a jet boat across a river. Now, if it's a very calm river, and let's also imagine that someone strung a rope across the river, which is the line that you're to follow. So the KAFFELOGIC roast control system is essentially looking at that line that you are to follow, looking at that rope across the river, and looking, well, let's just, for argument's sake, say that you're looking 100 meters ahead of your boat, and you're identifying the point on the rope about 100 meters ahead of your boat, and you're steering towards that point. Now, you can understand that if you get off the, due to waves and randomness, that you get off the line, that if you're always heading towards a point which is 100 meters ahead of you on the rope, you will come back onto line and keep going across the river pretty much on the line, so that there'll be little variations, but more or less you'll be following that line. And this is kind of what we're seeing coming up through here, where the roast control system isn't in action. Essentially, you're crossing the river and you've only just sort of turned on the lights and you've discovered that you're well away from the rope. And so you set your sights about 100 meters ahead of the rope and start heading for that. And gradually you come until you're perfectly on the line. And then by continually looking 100 meters ahead and heading for that point, you stay on the line beautifully. And then what happens at around about 180 degrees is the electricity supply company open the weir on their dam, and suddenly the current in the river has gone from being pretty much dead calm to suddenly water is rushing by. Now you can imagine what this does is it carries you downstream from that, that rope. And of course, you're going to head back towards the rope, but as long as that current keeps flowing, you're actually going to tend to sit just downstream of the rope. You're not actually going to come back online as beautifully as you would have if there was no current. So what happens in the roast is the roast control system is controlling the amount of heat energy going into the roast, essentially by controlling the temperature of the entry air. And when we get to a point where the beans start an exothermic reaction, then essentially that's like a current in the river. In other words, the roaster control system is now going to be responding the same as it was, but there's actually heat being generated by the beans as well. And so that's not taken into consideration by the control system. It's going, oh, well, I'm putting in a known amount of electrical energy, and I'm therefore adjusting according to that, without allowing for the extra energy that is going into the system. So what that means is it drifts off the line, and it will sit off the line now for a period of time. One of the ways to get it back on the line is to put in a zone. So what we're doing with the zone is effectively to use that analogy of you're crossing a river. With a zone boost, I'm actually saying to the boat, I'm saying, well, I'm not going to aim now for a point on the rope 100 meters ahead of the boat. I'm going to aim a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left. And you can imagine that if you did this, if you knew that the electricity supply company was going to turn the water on, you knew what time of day the water was going to come on, then you could actually head upstream a little bit. Like, I'm not going to head for the rope, I'm going to head 5 degrees to the right of the rope. And if you turn and did that just at the time when the water started flowing through, then you could actually stay on the line. You wouldn't have to come off the line. So what we can do is we can pop into profile settings, and we can, oh, well, we're going to need to look at our log. We're going to have to work out that on this particular profile, we kind of reckon that this whole thing's starting about 5 minutes, near enough. I mean, it does vary, it will vary by 5 or 10 seconds between different batches. So 5 minutes will do. And we could actually run this zone right through till 6 minutes. So let's just make it really, really simple. We'll set up a zone. Oh, hang on. Simplify things a little bit here. So Wayne actually has got a zone already in here, but I can go right ahead and add a third zone. Yep, grab that. Cool. So now I realize that there are some zones there, but I'm correcting for something that I saw despite those zones, so I can add another zone in, or I might go back and adjust the zones I was working on, but there's somebody else's zone, so I'm actually inclined to just go start at 5 minutes, end at 6 minutes. Well, Macintosh, okay, here we go. You get it. 6 minutes. And what should the boost be? Well, let's go back and try and get an estimate on the boost. I reckon that over that minute, it went to 197.5, and the profile was at 196.0 up to 197.2. So it's about 1.2 degrees, isn't it?
Chris, so looking at this log file, isn't this actually following quite well?
It is actually Yeah, I'm actually being very, very fussy here, going, oh, well, look, I could get it better following there because it's out by 1.2 degrees, and that came over a minute. So if I actually popped in here and made a boost of minus 1.2 degrees per minute, theoretically would now follow the line perfectly. So it is a very fine tune. But what this will do is it will counteract that exothermic energy that the beams are creating at that point. So at that point, I turn on a minus 1.2 degrees per minute boost. In other words, I'm going to steer to the right of that blue line, and therefore the red line should line up beautifully. Okay. So yes, I am being very fussy, Justine. And there's a whole other argument here, which Wayne made recently in one of our sessions, which is that actually bringing that onto the line is not necessarily a good thing to do for flavour.
It's taken him months to let go of that line.
And it's interesting when you think about it, like this whole idea of what are we doing, trying to control the temperature in the roast so beautifully. Actually, we're really not interested in the temperature at the probe. We're really interested in the temperature in the beam. And what we're particularly interested in isn't just the surface temperature of the beam, but the whole gradient of temperatures going all the way into the beam. And you can imagine that if what you really want to achieve is waves of heat traveling from the outside to the inside of the beam, and as each wave of heat flows in, it triggers different chemical reactions. And if you mess with this by reversing that flow of heat into the beam so that it starts to flow back out at a bit different point, is where you're disrupting the formation of those long chain polysaccharides, which are generating all the flavour in the bean. So if we did anything that would reverse that flow of heat, then we're probably damaging the roast. Now, what happens if you decide you actually want to follow the line when the beams go exothermic? You have to reduce power a little bit. And if you reduce power a little bit, you're dropping the air temperature a little bit. And that means you're actually saying, I'm going to make up for the energy the beams are making by cooling the air around them a little bit, which is actually going to undo some of that temperature gradient in the beam. So the argument is that in order not to do that, you actually have to let things get a little bit hotter at that point, because the beam's making extra heat, and you want to keep the temperature gradient. You actually have to allow the temperature around the beam to go up. If you don't let it go up, then you're starting to stall the roast by cooling the outside of the beam and disrupting that flow of heat and disrupting the temperature gradient in the beam. So the argument is that it's actually better just to leave the power and let the beam float up above the line. So the point of this lesson is to teach you how to use a zone to get it back onto the line, but it doesn't actually mean that that's necessarily a good thing. It's a control that's there for you to use, but use it cautiously, because it might not actually give you a better result in the cup. So that's how we would use a zone to deal with exothermy generated in this part of the roast. Now, the next area that you might want to use a zone in would be when we come to first crack. So let's just pull that log back up again. and look at what's going on around first crack. And what is going on around first crack in here is we are actually seeing a crash flick pattern. Now, in looking at that crash flick, you might think that that's too big a crash or a flick. We better just see what our smoothing options are here. Actually, I normally use 20 for my smoothing. Yeah, as soon as we use 20, it actually really helps us see exactly what's going on. There really is a crash and a flick there. And you can see the rest of the line is actually pretty good. So what Wayne has been doing, I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, Wayne, is that you're attacking that tendency to crash at first crack by pumping in a positive boost somewhere leading up to first crack. Would that be right? What sort of timing have you been using around that, Wayne?
So Chris, I've been kind of using anything from about 20 to 30 seconds before that to a good 20 to 30 seconds after that first crack phase. So 20 to 30 seconds before, let's say 20 seconds before your first crack, and then 20 to 30 seconds after that flick, as you can call it. And I've been kind of attacking that area. Yeah.
Yeah, so you would sort of go back to 6 minutes 50 or something.
Yeah. So yep. 6 minutes 50. So I'd started at 6 minutes 50, and I would start it, and I would go 7:14. Let me just have a look there. I would probably go 7 minutes 40, 7 minutes 45. That's where I would end it.
Okay, so we might be putting it in here at 6:50. Oh,
yep.
Beach ball again. 6:50 and ending it at 7:40.
Yep, 7:40.
The wrong spot.
Oh, hang on, I've put that in the wrong spot. 7:40 there.
That would be an interesting roast.
And the boost, you would put on a boost of 5?
Probably somewhere around the 5 or the 4. Just purely because I want to get that almost dump and flick. I want to get that up by at least a 5 and a 4 degrees. Yeah. So I'd go boost of 4.
Yeah. So what Wayne has done is now he's put on the boost so that this bit in here, which is the crash, is now going to have a little bit more. Now you can see it's already above the line, and that's just the nature of the KAFFELOGIC control system. It's not going to try and crash the roast to get it back on the line. But nevertheless, it is applying a minimum rate of rise of 3.2. So that's preventing it from crashing. But there's still a crash because when the beans come into first crack, of course, they absorb a massive amount of energy through their vaporization of the moisture in the bean. As the bean cracks, pressure goes down, water vaporizes, sucks heat out of the system, and the roast control system is not going to prevent that flatlining in there. And so the addition of a boost is a way of saying, well, turn on a little bit more power at this point, because we've actually now got to push in extra heat to replace the heat that's been lost due to vaporization. And Wayne, would you say that doing that would mean, I'll just go back to the log now, would mean that the flick we don't sort of need to attend to the flick, it's the crash that we need to attend to?
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely, Chris. So what this should do, is it should remove the crash. And in removing the crash, it effectively removes the flick, because what the KAFFELOGIC wants to do is the KAFFELOGIC understands the crash, and it wants to then pull itself right by adding the flick in, if that makes sense. So if we can remove the crash, effectively our profile will just remain on course. It might remain 2 to 3 degrees above, but it will definitely remain on course.
Yeah, yeah. So, because it was interesting, there was a little bit of a power dip in there, just leading into the crash, and so making a wee correction that avoids that power dip is going to be useful, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely, 100%, 100%. Yeah.
Would the screen be cluttered if you showed the zones on this page?
Sorry, say again, Justine?
Would the image be too cluttered if you were able to represent the zones on the graph?
No, it's something that I've been meaning to get on to doing. I'm sure there's a way of showing the zones that doesn't clutter the graph. We can do some nice background graphics there, I'm sure. Just something
Again, if you've got a checkbox, people can have it on or off as they want.
Yes, yes. It's just one of those things that hasn't got done yet. Because it is a bit irritating having to flick back and forwards between the screens like this. So yeah, something that's in the pipeline, Justine, but could be a wee while before we see it.
Yep. So, Chris, just to reiterate on that, I mean, we know that crash and flick in our profile does more damage to coffee, or does more damage to the flavor the more we taste our coffee. So the greater the crash is and the greater the flick is, will definitely negatively affect the coffee. What I'm trying to say is, if you have this slight minor crash and this minor flick, you might be able to get away with a lot of negative flavor, or a lot of loss of flavor within your coffee. But effectively, you want to nullify that. You want to keep that crash and that flick away. And that is kind of critically what you want to do. Now, you can do that in 2 ways. You can either add a boost to that, or your endothermic, so your heat application leading into that first crack, can be greater. And that will then effectively, once that exothermic kind of spill happens, that'll push that profile kind of more horizontally, and it'll keep it from crashing and flicking. So you'll see in a couple of the other profiles that we haven't used a boost zone in there, but what we have done is we've made sure that the heat generation before we get to first crack is a lot higher, if that makes sense. So there's 2 ways of doing it, basically. The one way is putting in that boost, and especially if you want to keep the profile as close to, if you want to keep your temperature as close to the profile, and if you're working with a bean that could be a little bit finicky on the heat application in the beginning of the roast. So you don't want to put too much heat into it at the beginning of the roast, because you could tip it or you could scald it, and you're very mindful of putting too much heat into the bean. Then what you could do is you could definitely add a boost into that first crack phase, and that would take care of that. Yeah, we say it'll take care of it, Chris. It might not take care of it. You might not have enough energy going out of your bean at that time, but it'll definitely nullify it. It'll definitely bring it down to an almost 0 point. Yeah.
So I mean, it kind of makes sense that like you can see that the rate of rise has come pretty low down here. If you think of it like riding a bicycle, the faster you go, the more stable you're going to be. And so if you're trying to ride a bicycle really slowly, then you're going to find you're wiggling around and you're making more corrections. And I think this is what's happening. Once you get the rate of rise pretty low, it's like you're going pretty slow and you're probably going to have to make corrections, but you wouldn't have to make them if you were going faster. Everything would just push through. So would that be a fair comment, Wayne, that essentially if you get up more speed and keep up more speed, you're less likely to see a crash?
Yep, absolutely, 100%. I mean, that's definitely what kind of the roasting has shown us, that if you're absolutely right, using the analogy of the bicycle, is if we have a little bit more speed going into the first crack, we're less likely to make mistakes around that kind of first crack phase, around the dumping and the flicking, or the crashing and the flicking. So I would look at it twofold. The one thing is, Chris, you've got to be very mindful of what coffee you're using, you know, and you've got to be mindful that doing that doesn't push a lot more energy into your coffee, which can then also result in a negative flavor, because you really don't have anything for your coffee to use, and you're effectively just fizzing out any moisture that your coffee would have. So you've got to be mindful of it. I reckon, you know, if you've tried everything, you can't get that crash and flick to stop. You've pumped a lot of heat into it. I reckon then your only way of trying would be to add a boost zone into that and seeing if that will make a difference. At the end of the day, we've also done profiles, Chris, where we've had the logs reflect at first crack, this almost wiggle in our profile as well, which you can see using that bean there. We definitely don't have that. So, and what we've kind of determined from that is that it could actually just be the coffee. The coffee could almost organically give you that drop and that flick to an extent. I mean, you can try and correct it, but the coffee might just not be able to handle that degree of roasting, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So,
so we're going to take all of these things into context. Yeah, we'll put all of them into context.
So I think what it means is if what you're trying to achieve is flattening off, quite severe flattening off of rate of rise, you're quite possibly going to need a boost.
Yep.
Whereas less likely to need the boost there if you're going for a faster finish.
Absolutely, 100%. 100%, yeah. Yep.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the great things about the KAFFELOGIC is that you can put that boost in so that you can actually start to really play with some of these slow finish profiles where you go up to first crack and then really slow off. You've got a degree of control that you can do that in a manner that doesn't result in a crash.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, definitely we don't want to result in a crash. We don't. That's going to really have a negative effect on our coffee. So sometimes you have to, you know, sometimes with a slower post first crack profile, you will dive into a bit of crashing. But you know what? If it tastes good, then that's okay. Then don't stress about it. But in this case here, that would definitely negatively affect the flavor that we want from our coffee. So we would have to add in a boost there. And we could change the entire profile, Chris, but we want that negative, we want that almost flattening out of the curve after first crack. But we don't want to lose the flavor. So it's this double-edged sword. So the only way for us to adapt that and to fix that is by putting in a boost.
Cool.
Without changing the profile. Yeah.
So what I've talked about today is I've talked about the exothermic sort of phase that comes in late Maillard, and then we've talked about crash and flick. And we've looked at using zone boosts for curing both of those, and we've also talked about some of the other options, which are the do nothing option and change the profile option, as well as putting in a zone. Now, I won't go on today to the next couple of topics, but I'll come back on Wednesday. I want to talk about general wobble and dealing with a general wobble with a advanced technique which is called a power profile. And I also want to talk about cornering. There's a corner setting which is a little bit of an unusual thing that we don't need very much of, but I'll go over that on Wednesday as well. So 2 things on Wednesday will be the power profile and the corner. And as for today, do we have any questions coming up in the last few minutes from what I've covered so far today? We've got a couple of minutes.
No, all good.
Oh.
Just wondering if you've got sort of a before and after there. Do you have another log of, for example, once you put that boost in, what effect that had on the rate of rise?
I don't on this particular one, but Wayne, you might have some historical, because you've been adding in zones in order to deal with things. You might have a before and after pair, might you?
Yes, I might. I'm actually looking for it right now as we speak. Thanks for asking that question. Hope I can get it in time. Let me just double check here. I hope I can get it in time for us before we kind of leave.
We could look at it tomorrow morning, Wayne.
Yep, it's probably easier if we could, but I do have them. Just look at my logs here. Yeah, probably easier if we look at it tomorrow. Let me see if I can find one for us. Probably the easiest.
Yeah. Well, let's do that. Let's look at that tomorrow. That's a good thing to do. You see, I haven't actually done a lot of roasting where I've been fine-tuning these zones, Simon. So Wayne's got more examples than me.
Okay.
I've found one. I'll definitely find one, Simon, that I have. I'll definitely find one.
Okay,
I'm looking at the logs now, but I've got like almost 5 or 6 911s of the same, or ready to drinks of the same profile. So I'm just going to have to go through each one of them and just see which one is the most perfect one.
All right, sure, thanks.
Sure.
Okay, well, let's start with that tomorrow morning, and then we'll take any other questions that come up as well.
Sure.
Okay,
yep.
Anything else before we finish today? Okay, well, look, thanks for joining us, and we'll see some of you tomorrow, no doubt.
Okay, cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.